Now, as we move into the Western world, we are really looking at the Greek process of colonization, and especially the interaction between Italic locals and Greek settlers. A previous generation of scholarship had a tendency to subsume such indigenous influences into Greek presence, and consider influences coming from native Latins or Etruscans as simply background actors. A large amount of Greek colonization seems to have been spurred on by communities coming out of Achaea in the northern Peloponnese and Euboea. At least in its early phase, the bigger players in the Aegean world, such as Crete and Attica, don't actually seem to have been that interested in colonization, which is a fascinating point of research as to why. The original assumption was that the Achaean and Euboean natives were driven simply by the need to find rich agricultural farmland. But given recent Phoenician evidence that I discussed a few episodes ago, the notions of trade and exchange also seem to be driving Greek expansion colonization, especially into southern Italy. As can be expected, the original Greek sources on their own view of colonization and the justifications for it don't always line up with the archaeological record and give us an actual historically accurate picture. The Greek term apoikia, applied to colonies in the 8th, 7th and 6th centuries, often gives us a skewed picture of what's really going on. The sources tend to give us an idea that the Greeks followed a set kind of process for how you colonize a place. Usually, it was said, you began with a mother city that was related to a particular process of colonization or settlement form, which other minor settlements then spread out from in the form of even minor colonies from the main colony. The implication, of course, in this is that the process of colonization was done with a systematic political model in mind that was planned as an expedition beforehand, usually one, we are told, that was led by an oikestis, a kind of political expedition leader. The image that the Greeks wanted to present was clearly that such movement and civilizing influence was being orchestrated and spearheaded by largely aristocratic groups, which went on to form the core of the new settlement and become the founding nobles or families. The other primary terminology that the Greeks used for their colonies was emporion. Without having a stable mother city, emporions were supposedly closer to trading outposts than independent political communities. A good example of this kind of community is Pithekoussai, a small island off the coast of southern Italy. While the site was historically always considered a Greek colony, as it has been revised in recent years, we've found evidence of Etruscan inscriptions, seals and signets from the Near East, all mixed up with imported Greek ceramicware. So again, as is the trend, there is a huge deal of diversity and cultural ethnicity that has gone overlooked. Interestingly, Pithekoussai is also the area in which that famous Cup of Nestor was found that contains one of the earliest sources of Greek writing, and I really don't think that's much of an accident. Unfortunately, much of the settlement itself hasn't actually been excavated yet. The focus has been much more on the cemeteries around it, which can be argued to give us a bit of a biased look at the site, honestly. Another major colony to look to that I mentioned before is the city of Metapontum, also in the south of Italy. This site is actually one of the most intensely excavated and well-studied sites in all of Italy and Greece, and it stands as a great example of just how much detail we can get from archaeological work. We don't only know the core site itself, but also the pretty much full extent of its hinterland and the village sites around it that were dependent on it, all of which belonged to the local population, such as the Inconodata. Inconodata seems to have been settled by indigenous Italians around the 8th century, who were attracted to the coast under the influence of new Greek culture. It seems to have been destroyed sometime around 640 BC, coinciding with the founding of the Greek colony of Metapontum. So naturally there's a lot of interest here, especially when we're looking at this small-scale indigenous site of Inconodata. Who lived here? What was their relationship to the Greek settlers? How did they influence each other? With Inquadrata, we're dealing with a pretty unique and coherent historical archaeological situation which developed during 2 centuries of occupation on the hills around it. There even appears to have been a monument that was built at the beginning of the 8th century and was weirdly destroyed by the end of it, at which point it was then pretty much immediately rebuilt in the same place at the time when Metapontum, a new mixed community of Greeks and indigenous people, was founded. The monument was destroyed again and then definitively abandoned at the end of the 7th century by the same kind of actions and logic that were employed the first time around. With evidence like this, we have to question the Greeks' narratives of their own colonialization process. It clearly isn't as simple as them just popping up on the shore and arriving one day and taking over and suddenly becoming the dominant force in a region because of their political superiority. There are clearly multiple waves of Greek colonization and migration that happened between the 8th and 6th century. And during that time, the colonies were trying to constantly assert themselves and acculturate to the local environment. Historically, the orthodox view in classical archaeology relied on later written sources, such as foundation decrees, refoundations, or founders' stories, to construct narratives of colonization. These often gave reasons for founding a colony, such as Plato's discussion of stasis, or civil strife, and stenochoria, the sort of land food shortage, or even demographic expansion, which led to a land shortage. The Greeks were seemingly expanding and colonizing because they were running out of room in their own towns, or there was population declines or famines or any of that kind of thing. This presents us with a picture of a Greek colony as a state-led enterprise, something that was probably government-funded, it was led by the aristocratic families, and it had clearly defined typologies that we thought we could group into things like polis, Apoikia, and Emporions. The challenges with this kind of narrative and approach, though, is that different Greek colonies may have different stories, but archaeologically, the process of colonization actually looks the same across the board. Pithekoussai and Megara, for example, appear to have similar patterns of waves of migration and foundation. There was also no polis in the 8th century. It was before it even existed, which means almost all of our written sources about the founding of Greek colonies, especially in Italy, for example, are retrojecting a political propaganda and emphasizing the ties of the polis to the Apoikia that likely didn't even exist yet. With the 2 phases of settlements from the 8th and 7th century, and then again from the 6th century, we see a huge variety of reasons for Greeks settling further west. Things like basic opportunism, a search for fortune, fleeing political enemies, all become apparent to us. And we can't forget the relationship between individual enterprise and the variety of cultural background in the settlers. So, how did a colony like Metapontum establish its centrality and control once it was founded in southern Italy? When we look at the geomorphological maps of the region, we can get a fairly good insight into the different types of landscapes that Metapontum had around it. We can then cross-reference things like geological biomes with archaeological evidence for occupation to understand which kind of landscapes the colonists are drawn to and what they're then doing with them. More than anything else, the main landscape that Metapontum colonists were attracted to is fertile soil bases, indicating that a large part of their intention was likely agricultural. Of course, to really know what they're up to, we need to know what the landscape looked like 2,500 years ago, and that is the current area of research in sort of reconstructing ancient environments. Another really exciting area of research for me with Metapontum is isotopic DNA analysis, primarily from dental records in cemeteries. Now, this is a fairly niche field, and it's quite difficult to work with because our sample size at Metapontum is quite small. But by comparing and contrasting the genetic evidence for settlers with indigenous natives in the region, we can actually get a fairly good idea of where exactly the colonists are coming from. One of the really interesting things that Rathman et al. Found in 2017 was that the DNA across the settlement wasn't uniform. The inhabitants of the Kora or rural areas of a colony, for example, were different from the locals. They came from different ethnic backgrounds, but also they differed even between themselves. So we're clearly looking at a huge diversity of ethnicities and cultures in the region here, both in the hinterland and in the city itself. DNA evidence like this provides us with a picture that is just really incredibly complex and multicultural. So the old narratives of Greek colonists assimilating or destroying local populations just doesn't stand up just to actual scrutiny. The archaeological evidence shows us multiple variables at play. Not only are we looking at economic exchange and the trade of material goods, but local populations are even assimilating Greek patterns and cultural behaviours and emulating them. And then those changes and those redefinitions of Greek culture are then being mirrored back in Greek society itself. This kind of muddled picture means that we can only really assess colonies on a case-by-case basis, and we can take literary sources about them with a really strong pinch of salt. During that 6th century BC, we see that second wave of Greek colonization, in which settlements are founded in places like northern Iberia and southern France. During this period, the impact and influence of indigenous and local communities and cultures is way more pronounced than in the 8th and 7th centuries. In the site of Marseille, for example, we see an incredibly strong local Etruscan influence in terms of cultural styles and trade exchange. The Etruscans seem to really like Greek ceramics, and especially, more than anything else, ceramics coming from Athens. Mainly, though, they're using them in funerary deposits and tombs or religious rites. Funnily enough, they also appeared to be modifying these shapes to create something that better copies their own local ceramics. A really good example of this is the Etruscan bucero. They create shapes like these canonated cantharos, amphora, or keanthos. Interestingly, 20 years later also, it seems as if the style actually caught on at the other end of the chain because the Athenians even start copying them as the pottery is coming back to them, which is really cool. So even though a lot of the original pottery is coming out of Attica, the Etruscans actually begin influencing the Athenians. In fact, what the Athenian potters appear to be doing is, much like the Mycenaeans in the generations before, adapting to their markets. The main one here being Etruria. As they often do, the shapes then become popular in Athens itself. If we look at a map here of the distribution of monumental black and red figure cups and philae during the 6th and 5th century BC, we can see clearly that they're huge in Etruria and central Italy, but they didn't really take off anywhere else in the Aegean. So the question is, of course, who is in charge of this? Who's orchestrating all of this? We might expect Athenian potters to be the ones who are pushing this, or it could be a case of local Etruscan populations having enough agency of their own to actually demand what they want in terms of their own imports. Both options are equally likely. This huge multinational, multicultural exchange didn't stop in the Archaic period, though. This trend continues way throughout the Late Bronze Age into the classical, Hellenistic, and Roman periods. In the Hellenistic period, I already mentioned places like Ain Khanum in a previous episode in Afghanistan, which is the central site for understanding these multicultural influences on the Greek world. Another excellent example of this trend is the Egyptian god temple at Marathon. Marathon had a huge importance to the Greeks in terms of ideology and identity, between the Greeks and the Persians in the wars. During the late Roman period, though, around 160 AD, the Greek temple there had numerous Egyptian cults and statues, including those of Osiris and Isis. Looking at them, though, they're a bit different. The Egyptian gods here are thoroughly Hellenized. They're depicted in classical fashion and sculpture. Interestingly, though, despite that classical influence, The sculptors appear to have recanted to the archaic style of sculpture that drew from Egyptian proportional conventions. In general, when we're looking at Greek archaeology's grand narratives, they've shifted a lot over the last decade. In particular, we're tending to adopt what's called post-colonial theory in our approaches, which emphasizes that we don't really have powerful receivers and subjugated nations in the record. We have something much more balanced and intermixed. The focus nowadays is on local indigenous responses to Greek influence, and vice versa, how local indigenous communities in turn affected Greek society and helped form Greek identity. We are far more aware of our own biases and, in some cases, racist approaches in light of the 19th and 20th century Philhellenism movements and cultural Protestantism. What used to be rigid categories like polis and emporion and apoikia, and even the notions of Hellenes and barbarians, are being very carefully dismantled. In general, there is a nice focus nowadays on what influences came back into Greece in light of its interaction with other cultures, as much as it formed Greece as we know it, which I think is a fascinating direction for some future research. So as always, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you next week for more discussions on Greek archaeology.